So thank you, Dr. Webster, for joining us in this set of conversations that we're having on YouTube during this pandemic. Jamieson Webster is a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. She's the author of The Life and Death of Psychoanalysis and Conversation Disorder, Listening to the Body in Psychoanalysis. She teaches at the New School and supervises doctoral students in clinical psychology at the City University of New York. Thank you for being here. It's quite late here in Barcelona. It's past 11, past 5 in New York. How are you doing?
It's happy hour here.
Yeah. How are you doing? How is life during a pandemic in New York?
Well, I mean, I'm both very lucky in a way in that my partner and I move around in different spaces. So we come out to Shelter Island and then we're in the city, and he has an office in the city that no one goes to but him, but he goes to the office. So we move around, which I think keeps us feeling a little bit more sane than some people who've been locked in their house. But it's also been a weird, because I was working in the hospitals. So that was a very intense moment.
Are you still working in the hospital?
I am. I'm going less, and they seem to need less, but I am still going once a week. I was going 3 times a week at the kind of heights of it.
As I told you in the email I sent you to ask you for this interview, I read your piece that you wrote in the New York Review of Books about your experience during these days of the pandemic. You volunteered in a hospital in Brooklyn, if I'm not mistaken, to help or to be with those that were in a terminal state, we would say, or could be in a terminal state, helping them navigate those moments, and also their family members that could not visit them with the same liberty that in regular times. Why did you make that decision?
I don't know. I did something similar at 9/11, so it's starting to feel a little bit like a habit, if not a compulsion of some kind. But I remember actually walking to clap for the hospital down the street in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and seeing the people with the gear on come out, which they would do some evenings, and wave to everybody. And there's something like the divide in the street, you're on one side and they're on the other. And I thought, I'm going to the other side.
You were running to the front, running to the front lines.
I made that decision. And I'm good at figuring things out, and I have a license and a degree. So I just kind of figured it out.
I didn't know you also did this during 9/11, but I guess during 9/11 was a bit different, in part because of that divide, right? Not only on the street, but also sick people are isolated, whereas I guess in 9/11 they were not. Is the job different because of that isolation?
No, but there was a line and I crossed it, which was that I went down, I found my way down to ground zero, and I worked down there with the other rescue workers and firemen and policemen that were down there for like about 3 weeks, I think.
In your piece, you focus in part in helping the family members that show up in the hospital, trying to be there with their loved ones. And sometimes you explain that only 2 people were allowed into a room, and a third family member was waiting outside, and therefore some technological means had to be used, or another family member that was away, and also you had to. This has been common also here. Nurses were connecting via WhatsApp. I want to ask about the 2 extremes of that action. First, the need to be there when someone is unconscious or about to die, and also the distance that this technology creates in this process. But let's start with the first one. Why do we fear dying alone or letting our family members die alone?
I mean, there's interesting psychoanalytic questions. One is who is the being there for? Is it the one who's leaving, or is it the one who's left behind? And I think philosophically and psychoanalytically, you would say that in a way it's for the one who's left behind, because the death is never your own death, but the death of the other that we experience. And it's something about mourning, or the necessity for a mourning process to take place, which is very fragile. I mean, it almost doesn't take place in the way that, you know, I believe that the unconscious doesn't metabolize death. It doesn't believe in death. So something has to happen to make you take in the loss in some way. I brought up, I think at some other point, that, you know, it's like the tradition of having hired mourners at a funeral, which sounds really fake, but you know, it's as if you need to see someone crying in order to have the emotion take place in yourself, which actually isn't fake. It's something about the fact that we have to see ourselves from the outside. We have to feel ourselves from the outside, and we shouldn't glorify some sort of internal authenticity in a way. So I don't know, psychoanalytically, I think a lot of the work that I was doing was for the family members, and a lot of the letters that I received in relation to the work I was doing was family members saying, like, the person just disappeared from my life. Something that I did start to understand much later in my work in the hospital was that many of the patients, if not most, and I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but many, were becoming psychotic in the hospital. You know, I kept saying to myself, why do I feel like I'm in an inpatient ward, which I used to work on, or I'm in like the Bellevue emergency room? And I didn't understand. And I kept asking the doctors, and they say, oh, well, the patient's confused, the patient's agitated. And I would say, well, agitated from what? Or why so agitated? Or what do you mean confused? And it was just the kind of question that you see doctors and nurses like gloss over. And, you know, psychoanalytically, I'm thinking, well, this doesn't make sense. Like, something here doesn't add up, and they're going from patient to patient to patient, but I'm trying to kind of figure out where these people are at. And I found out through happenstance, like watching something on the news, a term that I had never heard before, which is ICU delirium. And it turns out that 1 in 3 patients who's in an intensive care situation for more than 4 days, especially on a ventilator, become psychotic or delirious or paranoid in some fashion, like they mentally disintegrate. Probably because of the stress on their body, but also the terror and the confusion in a hospital, which has no day and night, which has people who are just poking you and treating you like a body and not a human being. And the prescription to get these people out of ICU delirium is that you need to, 1, try to lower the sedative medications, which in intensive care units, they just throw medication at these patients because it's better if you medicate them than them acting crazy. You have to bring family members in to calm them down, and you need to orient them to time and place and day, and see if you can pull them out of it, though it's very, very hard. And in some patients, it leads to a kind of dementia that doesn't go away, and they don't know why. They don't know why it like can become irreversible. So then I was completely terrified that this hospital was creating a kind of psychosis for these patients who were really scared. You know, and people didn't want to go into the rooms. They didn't want to touch the patients. They, you know, everyone's in these spacesuits. So it wasn't really until the end when I thought, you know, okay, I'm also here for these people, although I can't do anything. I really couldn't do anything. And that was very frustrating. And it's also why I've decreased going, because I started to feel really helpless at that point. You know, I tried to send articles around to the people who I was working for about ICU delirium, but no one cares, because it's just something that they can't manage. You know, they have to try to make these people better on the level of the sick body, and to attend on another level to this kind of severe mental health issue would be impossible, at least at this point in the US.
You said many things. You made me think now that you saw 3 types or 3 categories of people in the hospital: the sick people, their family members, and also the people working in the hospitals. Right? There are three communities or three types of people. We were talking about how family members need to be there, and you said it's not clear, or it seems as if they are there for themselves and not so much for the sick people. I remember when my parents died, both of them died in my arms. I thought the thought that the happiest thought that I had was I'd like to die like this. The things that I was doing were the things that I would like my children or whoever do to me when my time comes. And I was doing it for myself, but I was doing also as a ritual for how people should be treated and how I should be treated in that context. I don't know if that makes any sense in the categories of how we treat dying people today.
I mean, we don't treat dying people with a huge amount of dignity in the United States, from what I can see. And I think the medical system and what's become stranger and stranger about it, to the extent that it's less and less personal, you know, also treats death as an accident or a problem, you know, because you're supposed to just keep this body alive. Although I think there's long traditions of palliative care and people who've thought about these questions that are important, but you know, especially in a situation like this, it's not that situation that's called in or that can be found for a family member. But I mean, the idea of dying, like, you know, within what you know, within a situation in which you're oriented to the people, the places, the activities, the life. I think that that's an image that we have of what a good death would be, as opposed to the one that maybe comes out of nowhere, or the one that feels very desperate, or the one that's, you know, where you're part of a machinery that you don't know how to get out of, meaning like, you know, medical kind of machinery. But there's something else happened to me in the hospital, which was that, you know, one of the things that I was looking for, and I was looking for this maybe out of my own predilection, was eloquence, you know, eloquence at the end of life amongst family members and, you know, the dying. And there's a lot of ineloquence. There's a lot of just kind of desperate stuttering and, you know, not knowing what to say and fumbling. And I thought, why should I demand eloquence at the last moment? And so I you know, I kind of took myself to task for that, for wanting that, for looking for that, for being comforted by that, for thinking that would be a good thing at the very end. And why do we have to meet death with all these words? And of course, you know, being someone who's an academic and a writer, this is my defense mechanisms, right?
It's what's important to you, right? To make sense of it all at the last minute.
Right.
Procrastinating until the very last minute and then finding the eloquence to sum it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when here, and I guess everywhere, at least in the West, people were banned from going to see their relatives that were sick or in the hospital and intensive care. And people were starting to die alone. Many people died alone during this pandemic. I had like a split mind. On the one hand, you see, it seems not important. Factually speaking, you die. There's no difference. On the other hand, it's one of the measures or the new norms that revolted me the most. And I thought, well, if my wife or my daughters were in that context, I would ignore the law. I would, you know, hit someone in the face. I would kill no, but you know, I would do anything in my power to be there, even it wouldn't change anything. And I keep thinking about this. I keep coming back to this. Why is this important? Why is it important that we allow people to be there in that very moment? It's like a threshold of humanity, even beyond humanity, because animals like to be there as well when when other animals die. And I haven't, made sense of it all. I know I'm, saying the same, I'm asking the same question in different ways all the time, but still it's a puzzle that doesn't seem to have enough pieces to be solved.
Mhm. I mean, there's no way that a nurse, a doctor, myself can fill in for the loved one at that moment. I mean, even in the nature of touch, which was something I thought about a lot because, I was afraid. And so there was a period of time in which I wasn't really touching patients. I kept my distance. And so many patients were in so much distress that I started to touch them. And I watched their bodies calm down because, no one was touching them in a human way. They would come in and take the blood or fix the whatever. And sometimes it was quite violent because, they take the mask off and put the mask back on. And, nurses can sometimes be a little brash. And the situation in the hospital was so desperate. But I started to touch people. And so I can imagine that, part of the reason is to touch the person for the last time, in the last moments. And I don't think that they should be deprived of that, and that one should be deprived of needing to touch it. And it's not so different from my seeing the doctors on the other side of the street and wanting to go to the other side of the line, because I mean, I think the line has to be drawn because you can't have a hospital full of family members. But I understand crossing the line. I understand, imagining that one would do what one can to cross it, which is why I wrote about the one woman at the end of the New York Review of Books article who, stormed the hospital.
Yeah, the daughter that's a daughter for her entire life, right?
Yeah.
Interesting situation. I just recommended viewers to go and read the article. I will post it on the channel. So you mentioned the nurses now, and also in the article you mentioned the nurses not quite in a very good light, I would say. It looks as if, well, two things. First, personally, well, my sister is a doctor and she's been working in intensive care these days with COVID patients. And I talk to a lot of people on the phone, and my sister seems to be the most calmed one, or the least worried. She should be the most worried. She's seen it all. But there's some, and with my wife, we always say, well, she's a doctor, she's used to it. But she's used to it. I don't know exactly what it means for them. If they self-isolate psychologically, or if they find a way to cope with it by ignoring it, or they digest it in a different way. Have you seen this happening in your experience in the hospital?
I think so. I mean, I started to become numb at certain moments, and then I'm very careful to catch it and try to undo it and figure out what's happening. So I can only imagine. I can only imagine if it's day in and day out, and it's these huge shifts, and imagining the hospital doesn't treat you particularly well. I mean, I remember having a cigarette with, in the vicinity of the other nurses having cigarettes, and I wasn't talking to them so much, but I was listening to their conversation. And, one of the nurses died, and they were really upset about the way that the hospital handled it, and that they weren't notified, that there wasn't a moment of silence. Who cares about them then, was the question, if they don't care about this person who they didn't know that well, but they knew. And how can there not even be announcement? How can they not talk to them? So, I think it becomes really hard when you realize, I mean, especially here in the US, where the hospitals are businesses, and you have executives and you have people making decisions for you. And then on the other hand, you're there at the, in a situation with so many people that you have to take care of. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for the nurses. I feel bad if they came off badly in the article, but, and I saw them absolutely heroically, to the extent that, they take all the dirt. I mean, the patients are yelling at them, screaming at them, upset, and they're the ones who field all of it. which I have an amazing respect for, to the extent that they do a really good job to a certain extent with accepting people's idiosyncrasies. You know, they'll say, oh, so and so is always the one who's going to complain, or he's going to, push the buzzer 700 times, and they figure out what to do with each person. As a psychoanalyst, a lot of what we do is I listen to people complaining about the pain that the other's idiosyncrasies cause them, and their attempts to get control over it, rather than these nurses who, in like a kind of saintly way, accept the aggression and idiosyncrasies and problematic enjoyments of the other human being. And I felt like I learned something from them about that also. But I do think that there's a way in which you become habituated, unfortunately, in these kind of medical machines to a casualness.
You mentioned several
humor.
times the American healthcare system as a factor in this. And now you said this is business machines, executive making decisions. How does that affect the treatment? Because I cannot imagine exactly, if you are in intensive care, the fact that you're in a hospital that is a business. What does it change for the patient or the family members?
My partner was, he said, I'm really, proud of you for doing this, but he says, I also, want you to understand that you're free labor for a hospital that's charging, as Martin Amis says, for every tissue. And so that was on my mind in terms of the risk that I was putting my family in, and the fact that, they're all too happy to have these psychologists running around for free, helping them and putting their own lives at risk. Like, they don't care, as long as I've signed off on all the proper papers that relieve them of responsibility. What does it do to care in this country? I think we have the lowest quality of care, in a way. I mean, it's abysmal. I think, one of the things that in my own experience of the hospital, but also in watching it this time around, I think there's a certain moment in which there's a real apathy amongst everybody in the hospital, because it's not just an apathy that you feel towards the patients who, problems like, especially with COVID here in the US, most of the patients who are coming in, it should have been prevented, because being poor is a pre-existing condition, or Trump didn't shut the country down soon enough because of politics. So at a certain point, you feel like you're mopping up systemic failures. And it's hard to then see the humanity through that, because you yourself feel so abject in the face of what you're doing, and you feel yourself up against the weight of something that you can't change, doing the hour by hour work that you do, and that then feels interminable.
Why abject?
Why abject? I think just because of all the waste that it becomes, lives wasted, time wasted, money wasted, and that it's not what it should be. It's not a system that's designed to take care. It's a system that's designed to profit, which often sacrifices. I mean, which does 100% sacrifice care. And that was true, in my experience in working with, let's say something like psychosis or schizophrenia in the hospital when I was working in the inpatient unit, because, you either threw medications at the person so that they would stop being a danger to themselves or to other people, so that you could reasonably sign off, and then you just get rid of them. You send them to the next system, which is not going to catch them. But you just need to get them out of the hospital because the insurance doesn't want to pay past a certain point. So at that point, what are you doing? You're not helping that person anymore. And, I also know, psychoanalytically speaking, that to give a psychotic person medication to put them in an outpatient facility is never going to stabilize their psychosis. To stabilize their psychosis, they need an environment that wants to give them the minimum amount of drugs possible and the maximum therapy possible to get them to a place where, you know, they can kind of stabilize their psychotic system. And that's not going to be provided for them. They're
That's the
going to
other
be
aspect.
slammed.
Sorry. Please
No.
go on. Okay, that's the other aspect I wanted to ask about. One is the business side of this care that they're receiving. There's another thing that it's universal in every country that has a healthcare system that's minimally robust. That modern medicine, in your, at least the way you explain it, is focused on the chemical aspect, physical aspect, bodily aspect of it, like objects that you need to fix. And the approach has become so technical that there's a loss there that we seem to miss, but we don't exactly know how to express or point to. You published another article a couple of years ago in the also New York Review of Books about drugs and you know the psychoanalytic approach to psychological situations. This experience, I'm assuming, has reinforced that view that you know the approach is lacking this other aspect.
Absolutely. I mean, I worry about terms like biopolitics because I think I mean, I think it's very important, but I also think it's thrown around a lot these days in ways that worry me. But the idea that somehow the human is being lost and that we're being treated like a body, whether that's as an enjoyment to be harnessed by capitalism to make us want things and buy things and aspire to things that don't particularly make us be better people or feel better in any way, shape, or form. And that the medical industry also kind of works by statistics and works by, you know, kind of management of the body, as opposed to the idea that you're treating the whole person, that you see the whole person, you see their life, you see something about what they might need or their ways of being ill. I mean, this, you know, there's like an old idea that I have of a doctor who's kind of with you and listens to you. That's, you know, sounds a little like a psychoanalyst, but nevertheless, I really think that this is falling out of frame. I mean, in the United States in particular, this is what I see, is that it's falling more and more out of frame. And this was really, I mean, the idea that the patients, that COVID-19 and the way that we have handled it in the hospitals is a delirium factory. The Atlantic magazine, which is the only magazine that I saw reporting on this kind of question of the ICU delirium, ICU psychosis, said that COVID-19 is a delirium factory because the patients are treated as a body, more or less, that they're just treated as a body the minute they get in there, and that the hospital has to run with its efficiency to sort of get this disease under control and these people under control. Even the problem with the ventilators, that we're gonna use a machine to force your machine to work, even if that might destroy your mind. And that we've had evidence of this, that being on a ventilator longer than 4 days, when the COVID-19 ventilator average is 40 days, and the mortality rate on a ventilator, at least in the US, is 80%, but we will opt for this machine, I think, is like the ultimate way in which we are just a body at that point, a body to be kept alive up until the last minute. And then, you know, we feel like we've done what we're supposed to do as a society. And that's the only question that can then be asked. It's not a question about the dignity of life or what, you know, is there another possibility? Is there another way to sort of approach this disease? Or if we're going to use these machines and they're going to break someone's mind, then what do we then have to do? You know, none of this is being asked. None of this is being spoken about.
You're introducing a very sensitive question about costs, right? It's like the cost of saving a life might be losing a mind. And it seems that this question cannot be asked in any way. Not only with respect to minds, but also with respect to other things. Like we've decided that life is at the center, as we say. But by life, we mean the beating of the heart or the moving of the blood. And it's become a sort of a dogma that it comes from both right and left. It comes from the politics of every cultural contemporary approach to how we live, and it's become impossible to raise the question, say politically, say the freedoms we are losing because of the need to protect life, or if we wear masks, say the loss of the face as something that's on the public space and we can deal with, or what you're saying, right? The loss of mind. You make me think of my daughter, who yesterday was doing this and saying, I cannot put my head off of me. And I said, what's mean in that sentence? Right? Me is the rest of the body, or what is the me in that
Right.
sentence? Right? She didn't say, I cannot put the body out of me. She said,
Right.
head, right? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Like that idea of putting life at the center, it comes at the cost of impoverishing the meaning of what we mean by life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we have the discourse on the question of what makes for a good life, or what even people minimally need to have a decent life, has really fallen by the by. And something that COVID-19 has brought back in terms of the discourse that's circulating is the capacity to ask these questions again, because it turns out that this wasn't a virus that affected everybody, but it was a virus who affected certain people whose life we didn't protect or value in certain ways. And then it made us all ask questions about what we minimally need, and then also reducing our kind of running around, and our purchasing habits has also shown us that we actually need much less than we thought that we needed, which is interesting. But I think that we lack, maybe it's a kind of secularization of the world, but we lack a language for what counts as life. And I'm not religious, but I do kind of see in religion ways of speaking about life and death that I think are very different than what we have at this point in time.
It's interesting that you say we lack the tools, right? Like the words. We don't know how to speak
Yeah.
about this. I haven't thought about it in this way. It's interesting. The article you published, not the last one, but the one on the use of medication for psychological, let's call them problems. Can we go over a little bit your argument there? Because I think it's very countercultural. And I'm sure it's been difficult for you to publicly defend that. Probably took a lot of heat. The gist of it is that you question the pervasive presence of medication to treat all forms, little or big, of psychological situations, from anxiety to sleep deprivation, from attention, how's in English? ADD, attention deficit disorder.
ADHD, yeah.
Can you explain your take on that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, that article on the one hand came on the tail of writing the conversion disorder book, and conversion disorder was the psychiatric term for psychosomatic issues. But it's actually a very old term in Freud before it's the psychiatric term that we think of now, which means the capacity to move energy from one sphere of the mind or body to another. Just that you take something that's in one place and you push it somewhere else. And this splitting, this way in which it creates a division and a split for Freud is important, because then it creates a symptom, because you have one thing that was somewhere else that's now in the other place that has to represent the movement that it's engendered in the person. And
Can you
he
can you
saw
give
that
us
as
an
an,
example? Can you give us an example of this?
well, the classic example would be, you know, if you've lost your father and then you paralyze your arm. You know, that some whole complex of ideas and thoughts and feelings then erupts as a bodily symptom. But it doesn't have to be just that. I mean, it can be that some kind of experience that you've had, whether it's a passionate love or a trauma, then moves into a kind of obsessional thinking. Let's say that, like, you know, that it just moves from whatever it was, a memory, a bodily memory, into like a form of thought. But for Freud, the interesting thing is the creation of two spaces for one thing that then have to be analyzed, and the link has to be made between the two of them.
You say in the
Um,
article that Freud changed his mind on the what those symptoms were useful for. In the beginning, it had a negative perspective on them, but then at the end of his life, he saw those kind of symptoms as ways of, you know, solving or at least coping or at least negotiating with those things that happen in your mind.
He saw them also as creative. I mean, he saw them as an act of creation by the mind. So not like he moved the idea of it as a negativity into a positivity, and that if you could move something like this, well, then you could move it in all kinds of ways. And sublimation, for example, which is like the kind of psychoanalytic highest achievement, is in fact this very same movement. Like, you take basically your sexual pathology, sexual interests, sexual desires, and you apply them into a creative act of some kind, and it's supposed to give you the same pleasure that you would get from fucking. Making your paintings, writing your books, you know, even though you have to spread it out over a very long period of time. And so, you know, this was like the coup de grace for Freud. And so I wanted to go back to that to say, like, bodily pain, bodily problems, bodily discomfort, or even the ways in which we feel bad or feel sick are not just the negative, you know, that they're part of a potentially positive production if they can be mobilized in the right way, which is what psychoanalysis seeks to do. Drugs, for me, stop this process in some way, I think. I think that they, in even the desire for the drug itself is a desire against the kind of movement that your body, your mind, whatever is trying to go towards. It's, you know, because the person who wants the drug wants to stop feeling what they're feeling or want something to go away, even if they want it to go away in order to make what they believe something else is possible. But from my experience of drugs, I just always found them a hindrance to psychoanalytic work itself. It just seemed as if they were like in the way, that, you know, you just put like a glass shield into the treatment. And the other thing that was happening at the time, which actually came back in the COVID hospital, was we were in the opiate crisis. This is, you know, when all of these, it's still happening, of course, although less because people are taking less drugs in lockdown. But you know,
I think so.
people
Yeah.
were, yeah, it's been true. Yeah, it's been true that there's a little bit less, you know, overdoses and things like car crashes from driving drunk. Like, all of this is down, which I find strange. I think that people would do it more,
But
but
not to question the hypothesis, but it could be also because we're driving less rather than because we're taking less drugs, or
that's true.
or also the market for illegal drugs, at least. It's more difficult now that you cannot, you know, wander freely everywhere as you used to as well.
Well, I also think like borders closing has caused some
Of
problems
course.
of getting the drugs into the country. But you know, one of the opioid, you know, just I was also thinking about that, about all these people numbing themselves with painkillers and even dying because of the desire to reduce the experience of feeling the pain of life, which I understand, and I want to medicate it myself. But the question was, what happens when it's prescribed to you by a doctor as opposed to you going and illegally taking drugs, or when these prescription drugs, which are very seamless, flood the market? One of those crazy things in the hospital was that fentanyl, which is the drug that's killing everybody, that's ending up in the heroin, is one of the medications that's used for people on ventilators. So in every room I was in, I like, because they have the machines that tell you which drugs the patients are on, I like would see fentanyl in every room, which I found bizarre. Just because I had spent so much time thinking about fentanyl.
The
So, you know,
opioid crisis in the US, can we stop a little bit there and talk about it a little bit? Because in the US, it's also a very common topic for the last, say, 3 or 4 years. Everywhere in the press, you see stories about it. There seems to be some moment of self-consciousness and collectively, like we've been doing this. It's also politically linked to the triumph of Trump somehow, maybe not explicitly, but there's something there that talks about desperation and you know and how it's a drug of white people that are dispossessed, and it's the same people that shifted their allegiance from from one political view to another, and there seems to be a link there, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I also think of heroin as a kind of nostalgia drug. I mean, insofar as it's to create the feeling of no anxiety, no pain, which you always imagine was something in your past. Oh, back then when it felt better. So to go into the kind of opioid state is to go into this kind of make America great again
It's a shot of heroin.
fantasy.
That hat is a shot of heroin. That's what you're saying.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or it's the shot of heroin filled with fentanyl is the problem. um, no, I think the empire in decline and the people who are feeling that because they believed themselves to not have been in decline and were oblivious of the people who from the beginning say, this was not a great country, this is not a safe country, this is not a country that I felt took care of me. But you believed that, are the ones who I think are turning to the heroin for sure. And also the people who are enraged, right? Because they feel that they have been deprived of their rights in some way.
In your article about medication, you attack some drugs that are easy to side with you in that war, like the excess of painkillers, or even sleeping pills. But also you question the use of these drugs in severe mental disorders. You explain the case of a Canadian experiment. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, this is what I was mentioning before when I was talking about psychosis, which is that Freud, Freud understood this because, well, I mean, most of the psychiatrists from the turn of the century, I mean, psychiatry is not that old of a profession, but the psychiatrists didn't have these tools or weapons that we have now of the medication. So what you would see is that someone who becomes psychotic, usually the kind of the form that's always mentioned is paranoid psychosis, paranoid schizophrenia. That the person has to pass through the acute kind of crystallization of their delusion, but that they can come out the other side and kind of stabilize it in a way that it's as if it crystallizes, and then they come out of it and they'll always be somewhat psychotic, whatever that means, but that they can live with it more quietly than in its most acute form. Nowadays, part of what happens, and that requires a lot of care, and it requires a place that they can go, that they can stay for a while until that takes place. It could take 2 years, it could take 5 years, it could take 10 years, I don't know. Nowadays, we don't do that. We don't institutionalize people. We don't provide care for them. We medicate them and we send them out into the world, in which case what they usually do, because the medications make them feel terrible, is they come off the medications, become psychotic again, go to the hospital, get medicated, come off. I mean, it's just they're in and out of the emergency room their whole lives. And they deteriorate mentally over the course of this process, because you can't go in and out of psychosis like this. I mean, it has a detrimental long-term effect. So in Canada, They built a nice hospital filled with Lacanian analysts who decided to like put people on.
The way you tell it, it looks like the setup for a joke. You build a nice building, you fill it with Lacanian psychoanalysts.
And then you say, psychotic people come. But they did this. And they used the minimum amount of medication possible. It was also a place that if you weren't feeling good, you could go and just stay there. And there would always be someone there, and that you would have a long-term doctor kind of following up with you. And they showed that these patients stabilized over time and cost Canada less, because the hospital has been running now for 30 years. And so they did this long-term study, and that the patients cost less and are able to make money. You know, they're not just this burden on the system where you keep shuffling them around all over the place and passing the buck, essentially, from acute care to basically incompetent care. And I, you know, even if this is like a Americans Canadian fantasy sort of Bob Dylan problem, I believe it. I do. You know, everything that I've seen, everything that I've read, makes me believe that there's other forms of care that that we can provide that we just don't anymore.
How did medication become so important? How did this happen? This is very recent, and it's very normal is the word. Actually, it's a precise word. It's become normal for people to go to medication for everything.
I think we like the object. I mean, I have conversations with my colleague all the time. He's a psychoanalyst, and we write together. And you know, he likes to emphasize the materiality of the pill, the substance. That, you know, we see patients, they get very attached to it, the taking of it, the glass of water, the like feeling it dissolve in your mouth, the knowing that you swallowed it, the like waiting afterwards to, you know, to feel the effects. Even if you don't want them, you can check for them. I mean, there's a attachment to the substance, which, you know, we also know from drug addiction. I mean, there's a real attachment to the substance, the ritual, the imbibing, the orality of it all. That's very different from speaking, let's say, to one another, in which, you know, what do you like me? Did that go okay? What did you think of that whole situation? Did I learn anything? What has the effects there are much more ambiguous. And that require a different kind of sense of the importance of what you're doing when you engage in, let's say, like speaking with someone, even if it's every week or 3 times a week or whatever it would be. And people love even like the pill in their pocket, like anxious patients, like to carry the benzodiazepine in their wallet and know that it's always there. It's a real attachment. It's also the attachment to this thing, you know, like the substance and materiality of the phone. You know, you can see the attachment almost immediately, you know, that it becomes like a part of your body. It becomes like a manipulation of your own body and your own sense of enjoyment and anxiety.
That piece, and also what you've written, and interviews that I've heard that you have partaken in, you defend, you describe yourself as a Freudian psychoanalyst, and then you always add some like disclaimer, good humored comment, like whatever that means, or if that means anything today, or all that, as if you had to, you know, apologize for still defending Sigmund Freud. So I have 2 questions. One is, why are you a Freudian psychoanalyst? And I have a quote for that question that I'll read to you in a second. And then also, why do you feel you have to say that disclaimer, right? Like, so the quote is, it's from your piece. I think it's the medication one. You say, I have the sense that we need it more than ever to help us with our discontents, because there is an enduring value in the Freudian understanding of, on the one hand, the unceasing conflictual relationship between civilization and neurosis, and on the other, what talking simply talking can do. Why are you Freudian?
Why am I Freudian? I mean, one is Freudian because one has been in Freudian analysis. I mean, there's this pyramid scheme aspect of analysis that I don't think we can get around, because I mean, it is something about the fact that you did this, and it hopefully, I mean, you wouldn't do it unless it did something for you, although you can imagine that you have to start to believe in your own mythological tale about yourself. But
Okay,
I'm also,
no, well, let me stop you there. I'll Americanize the question then. Why should someone go to Freudian therapy instead of other forms of therapy?
I think it's the only intellectual therapy. I think it's the only therapy that cares about language and history and words and the interstices of the mind, the like not obvious aspects of the mind. So I would only go to a Freudian or Lacanian analyst because I believe in order to read Freud, who's a fascinating writer. I mean, he's a real writer. Lacan's not a writer. Lacan's something else, but Freud's a writer. And to be someone who's decided to read Freud, you have to care in a certain way that I would want in the person who I'm going to speak to about my life. That's one answer, and that may sound really elitist in a country like mine. And so, you know, I should go only be the Freudian analyst in New York that I can be, who published it in the New York Review of Books. But on the other hand,
you are part of the elite. I'm sorry to tell you. I don't know if you were aware of this, but in case you weren't, I have news for you. You're part of the elite.
I don't think it's a treatment for the elite. I think to be a Freudian analyst, one engages in a certain kind of an elitism, but I don't think that it's a treatment only for the elite. And I've worked in clinics in Harlem, and as you know, I love going into any hospital that will let me come into it. I don't, I mean, and I think that it's not patronizing at all. I think it's a way in which it's probably the one form in which an elite kind of obscurantist reading then actually has a legitimacy across the board, because it really teaches you to hear people, to hear any kind of person, even people that I don't like if I, you know, get a patient who I think is a Trumpist machismo asshole, let's say, but I will figure out how to listen to this person against my own biases. So, you know, it's funny because we're saying that it's this elitist thing, but I love the universal applicability, like the idea of dreams. I mean, everybody dreams, you know, so at a certain point you can just ask people about that. And everybody has sexual fantasies, so you can ask people about that too, and start there. And care about that, care about things that I don't think that the pill pushers care about. I mean, they care about you insofar as you take the medication and tell them that it worked out for them.
The first year I taught in New York, in San Francis College in Brooklyn, I had this intro to philosophy class with a bunch of students that didn't want to study philosophy. They didn't choose to study philosophy. It was just a requirement for their degree. And the first day of class, I asked them, okay, do you know any philosophers? If I ask you, you know, mention a philosopher, what name pops up? And they only Freud came up. Freud and Paulo Coelho were the two names that appeared in that class. So I was aware of the task ahead. And then I asked, okay, forget Paulo Coelho, let's talk about Freud a little bit. What do you know about Freud, right? And there's three facts that they knew, and I think there are three universal facts that people know about Freud. One is cocaine. Mm-hmm. He took cocaine, and then later he discovered that this might be not such a good idea. Then sex. Mm-hmm. like someone focused on sex as an explication or explicating factor for many other things, and the Freudian sleep. Right, these were the three things that people knew about Freud. Let's disregard cocaine and the Freudian sleep. Why is the sexual aspect important in Freud, and why you mentioned it 2 or 3 times in this conversation? Why do you still think is such an important or central aspect of our life that may explain other things?
I mean, Freud was interesting about sex because the question for him of sex was the way in which it constellated so many things. So you could think about drive, you could think about instinct, you could think about the body, you could think, you know, like the explicit nature of sexual fantasies, you could think fetish, and perversion, so on and so forth. So he loved it for constellating so many things. And he wanted a language that somehow never gave up on all the sides of it, the materiality, bodily aspect of it, the romantic kind of love, eros aspects of it, the way in which it was also physical tension, economic systems, you know, like a regulatory system in the body. And it was like as if he constantly wanted to reshape language to make sure that it kept all of these in balance. And he would fight with his colleagues who would make it too much, so like too social. So Adler socialized it, and he made it a question of whether society was prohibiting things or emphasizing other aspects, weighting things too much. So he said Adler had gone too social, and he said Jung had gone too spiritual. Right? Jung wanted like the anima and the sort of spiritual version of sexuality and got rid of the body. And so he always wanted to keep this front and center. I think the mistake, and a lot of what people think, is that it becomes an explanatory system. Right, as if sex explains what you're doing rather than that sex forces you to speak about what you're doing in the analyst's attention to it. And so I think one of the ways in which people deride Freud is to say, oh, you know, everything's always sexual. Yeah, whatever. Okay, I wanted to have sex with my mother. Like they make this joke. And I do think that analysts bastardized this at a certain point in time. I think 1950s megalomaniac psychiatric versions of psychoanalysis, like you would go to your analyst and they would explain all of your sexuality to you. Versus the idea that Freud's attempt to do this is also the attempt of the analysand and what you help them do, but that you're always attendant to sex, but sex in its ambiguity and sex in its complicatedness and sex in the way in which it constellates so many aspects of subjective experience. And I think that the analyst develops a kind of bizarreness where it's not that you're explaining everything by it, but that you're listening for the places that it's like creeping into life, creeping into speech, creeping into, I don't know, what one can say about oneself. And also what one doesn't say. I mean, that's the other thing, is that you're listening to what's not said. So I'm always looking at the society and, you know, like where has the discourse become too romantic? Like, where has it become too romantic and it's lost the kind of carnality of human life? And then where has it become just pornographic and it's lost the other aspects of the aspiration? And also there's also some truth here about children. I think this is, you know, one of the first things Freud discovered was that, like, as a species, we had scotomized infantile sexuality. Like we just like erased it. Like sex starts after adolescence, after the maturation of the genitals. But there's something about the experience, and I work with kids where, I mean, their whole experience of the world is this like body that then does go under repression. I mean, when you have kids, so I don't know, when you see like kind of when they turn into these latency age kids that want to like attend to the rules and play games and like know what the adults think and what their friends think, and they lose all of that intensity of the pre-5-year-old child. I mean, for me, that's an image somehow of all of the sexuality right there at the surface. You know, when your daughter says like, take my head off, there's something, there's something very powerful about that. I mean, how many women for the rest of their life want someone to take their head off?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I don't pretend to elucidate this in such a short conversation.
Right.
But um, if you look at something long enough, it tends to, you know, multiply in different aspects that you can then make dents and explain. And I'm I must confess that maybe it's my taboo system that when you talk about sexuality with kids, it raises alarms in my head, and I recognize, I see in my daughters and other kids, and I've worked with kids before, so I see sensuality. I see like the approach of the body to the world. That's clearly there. Also, pleasure is there. There's a system of pleasure and not pleasure and pain and all that is there. It's not binary, of course, and it's not always for pleasure and against pain. You know, there are several moments there, but it and I wouldn't say sexuality is not there at all,
Mhm.
but it's clearly different. It's clearly, it has nothing to do, also in my own memory, it has nothing to do with the urgency or the imperative that appears after the maturation of the genitals, as you put it. And I sometimes, when I see, for example, here, public education, my children go to public school, and there's a program now that they're starting to develop about that, about sexuality in children. And there was a pilot program in a school, and then they're trying to move it to other schools. And there's a fear of ideology in me on the one hand, and there's also a fear of trying to put on things that children do, meanings that are not there, that are in our way of looking at them. I don't know. This is not a question, just a, you know, an appreciation, you know, comment on why I fear this. Um, do you think this is reasonable?
I do think it's reasonable. I think the imputation of meaning is something to be avoided. And I think, you know, I stress listening over imputing meaning, because I don't think that there's any inherent meaning in sexuality. Even the problem with it is that there's not any meaning per se. And so then so much meaning is attracted to it. And the idea in analysis is to elaborate out from it, not for the analyst to impose meaning and to see meaning. So I mean, you know, like a lot of the way in which I think of analysis is it's a process, and there's like an articulation, and the analyst is sensitive to certain things because of what we've theoretically. You can't navigate an analysis without a map, but the map can't be absolute because you can't apply the map to every single person. But you have to have some compass points, and I would say that sexuality is one of them. But what each person comes to tell us, you know, potentially changes our theory about it. Every patient. So when you're dealing with something like, you know, applying psychoanalytic principles to what it is that we're going to speak to children about, I don't know how psychoanalytic that is. You know, that becomes a kind of question of ideology and education, and what do they want to achieve by this? Because the analyst doesn't want to achieve anything per se. But I mean, I do believe in whatever we mean by infantile sexuality. I mean, I don't think that you can get away from the craving of the child for the breast as somehow not sexual. I mean, there's nothing more demanding than a child at the breast. And to take them off of it is very hard. It's very hard to wean a child. It's incredibly difficult. There's a voraciousness there that I think is as voracious as what we do once our genitals have matured. Which, you know, there's no meaning there though, which is interesting. You know, that it's a moment in time in which we're a human being with another human being, and we have to figure out what to do as parents. It's very strange. There's no handbook, right? I mean, and every time a parent handbook comes out, it contradicts the last one. You know what I mean? Sleep with your child, don't sleep with your child. Wean them, don't wean them. Breastfeed them, don't breastfeed them. We can't get this right. And there's something for me about sexuality that is that, you know, that it's always poking a hole in knowledge, morality, even ideology.
When my wife was pregnant, I was still in New York at the new school, and I remember that feeling, like reading books and that were contradicting one another. And a friend of mine from the new school said, "Good, good, because the point is not the book. The point is that you're reading it. So the point is the care behind the interest of like seeking out the book and trying to figure out what's going on. That's enough. It's good enough." He was like, "Don't worry about it. The fact that you're worried, that is good enough. You know, then you sleep with them or you're done. You breastfeed them or you're done. But then, you know, if they're scared, I mean, it will go well." You said earlier, Freud is a writer, Lacan is something else. Let's talk about something else. What is Lacan?
He's a teacher, which, you know, people forget that his writings are one book that he published when he was 64 years old, but that for 28 years he did this teaching that has become his seminars. So I think he's a teacher. And teachers, he's a teacher that doesn't systematize. You know, he's a teacher who was rigorous insofar as once he got on a topic, he would start reading about that topic, but then he would just get up and he would speak kind of extemporaneously. And you have no idea how much he planned anything that he did in the course of a year. I mean, he had points that he wanted to hit along the way, but as any of us who teach know, you create a plan and then you sort of abandon ship at a certain point. You let the class take over in the way that it does. I think hopefully if you're a certain kind of teacher. So he was a teacher. He was a reader of Freud. I mean, there's not another psychoanalyst, and I like many of them, but there's not another psychoanalyst who's taught me to read Freud. I mean, he does something. A Freud text is there and he just turns it inside out. And he shows you something, and he shows you the logic in Freud. Freud kind of like, Freud is a writer and he writes and he doesn't know what he's saying in that way that writers don't know what they're writing. Lacan finds the hidden logic in it. And in that way, he's very philosophical. And it's why a lot of, I think, his references are philosophical and why philosophers are attracted to him, because he was able to see a logic in Freud and then to extract it and formalize it, which is what he did, you know, after the years and years of teaching. And he's not a great writer. He's a very strange writer. He's a complicated writer. He's sometimes these flashes of absolute brilliance, but I mean, it's overwrought, almost Baroque writing.
You resent him, I see. You resent him for that.
Right. I mean, one of the things you realize as you get into the seminars is that he took his teaching and then it's as if he would compact it into the text that often went along with the year of teaching. And so it's funny because if you think of psychoanalysis, it's a dream that's very compact and condensed, and then you analyze it and it becomes this long analysis where you take the whole thing apart. Lacan did the opposite. He spent a year taking something apart, and then he turned the text into the impossible dream of the year of teaching. And you see this in the most extreme fashion with Joyce. So he had in his 23rd seminar, so it's like really towards the end, he did a year on Joyce, and it's a strange seminar. And then he wrote a text called Joyce, the Symptom. And it's this impossible, bizarre, brilliant, practically unreadable, absolutely untranslatable text on Joyce. And when I realized what he's doing in that text, how he's compressing the seminar, I don't know how he did it. It's not the direction that you can go. You can start with something that's handed to you that's compact, and then you can open it up. But how he took something open and closed it into this ball. I don't know how he did that.
A couple of more things that just to finish. You mentioned you find a way. You said even if you have a patient that you don't like, you find a way to listen to him or her. I want to talk a little bit about that. Your job as a clinical psychoanalyst. What does it mean to listen for long periods of time, day after day or week after week? What's the toll of that?
It's very lonely, which I hadn't expected. I hadn't really thought about that, because you think that you're with people all day, but actually you're not with them like you and I are speaking. You're in a very different position. And so that it's very lonely, I would say. There's also something that's come up, which is that analysts have to speak to one another, that we have to be in supervision, that we do these groups, that we do these readings. And it's always there's something crazy about analysts, which is that we work very early in the morning to see people before work, and we work very late at night to see people after work. And then we have meetings from like 8 till 11 p.m. So like there's this masochistic structure to being an analyst that I find preposterous and wrong. And I don't know what to do about it. But if you don't work with each other, there's a risk of falling into a kind of narcissism, of that aloneness, that loneliness, that listening, the projection of the patients, the rescue fantasies that we're all came into the profession having. And I feel that. I feel like you can like drift into a kind of narcissism. I mean, I think it's probably a danger for academics also.
You think so? Haven't noticed.
You haven't noticed. I guess it just has more consequences as an analyst, but I think about that. The other thing is that it's a kind of attention that you can't give in the rest of your life. So that's strange, because I really think about my patients, and I listen to them, and I spend concentrated time with them, and over large periods of their life. And I don't have the same kind of thing with my partner or even my son. And I find that weird, because I don't know them as well. But I also don't know my patients, right? Because I only know them in a very, very, very strange setting.
Also, you said, I mean, it's very, when you defend Freud, you also mention that attention, sometimes it works well when it's not focused, right? When you are unconsciously doing something, you're more genuinely there than when you're trying to be, focused on something, which is counterintuitive, right? You would say that some things we only learn if we are, ready to be alone in a room, bored and focused, right? So maybe that attention puzzles me, because I sometimes cannot pay attention to things. It doesn't matter what I do, I cannot pay attention to things. But it's your job. There's a dimension of it that is just your job. You have an appointment, it's 5 p.m., it's a Thursday, and then you have to be there and pay attention. And I don't know if the technique, to put it a bad name, if the technique of paying attention to someone's words and what they don't say, as you said, has in you, or may have in you, the same effect that the nurse has when she or he deals with just the body, that you become numb to the genuinely present listening of it all.
You can, and I think it's a real danger. And if I could arrange my life differently, I would see 5 patients a day rather than 10, because I'm not, at a certain point, I watch myself stop listening, or listening maybe mechanically or not listening. It's not fair. You know, like, I don't be the 3 o'clock patient, because that's when, you know, all analysts kind of collapse exhausted at that point in the day. But I mean, these are the dangers. But you know, the ideal, which it's never exactly that, I think, is that you are never completely habituated. That speech is always surprising. That something unexpected is always potentially there, and as long as you can receive it, or in a position to receive it, to hear it, or kind of alert to it, that it will turn up. And that's what we have our ear open for, because those moments, the Freudian slip moment, although I think they happen in really less obvious ways than the kind of joke about it, it really does open up a part of that person's mind that neither of you expected. And that's always what I'm hoping is going to happen, and that I've seen happen, and that makes me committed to this. And you know, I'm like 20 years into practicing, but let's say like 10 years into full-time private practice. And you know, there's a moment in which you think, okay, I've spent a lot of time with people, and I've become attuned to a certain kind of thing. And you know, I wake up at certain moments. It's like the patient wakes me up because I hear something that I know, like I hear something funny. And then, you know, when it does something, even though it's not necessarily what I expect, but that, like, I did hear something, you know, you go, oh, right, you know, I'm an analyst again. Here I am, I'm here. And it makes me really happy. I mean, it's like, you know, it's why I keep doing this, and rather than, I don't know, piss off to Montana, I don't know.
And I want to ask lastly about the toll outside that very strange situation that you mentioned. Of course, many people don't know you're a psychoanalyst, but many people do know that you are a psychoanalyst. And I wonder if you feel like the sort of a Heisenberg effect. Like, many years ago, I went to an African country, and before leaving, a nun that had been living there for a very long time, teaching kids, a nun, she told me, don't bother trying to hide who you are, because those people, just by see you walking 3 minutes, they will know who you are. And as you may imagine, I spent the whole summer walking in a very weird way, because I was so self-consciously like naked that I didn't know how, I mean, suddenly I didn't know how to walk, right? And when I was preparing for this interview, I thought something similar, like, well, this person will not only hear what I say, he will see what I don't say, or he will see how I move, or he will see how I speak, or whatever. He will see things that I don't see about myself, and I'm exposed to that person. And I don't know if that's something that happens to you outside your practice, and that you must bear the toll of, like, people thinking that you have like that superpower that, you know, allows you to see through them, or some, at least to see some things that are not apparent for everyone else.
Well, we call that transference, and it's very important and useful, because the idea that there is somebody in the position to know something means that you'll start speaking to them in the hopes that they show you what they know. You know, and the analyst harnesses the effects of this. The person who knows is only you. It's not me who knows. I mean, there's things that I know, and there's things that I know how to do, and I know how to kind of help this process along. But it's very important. So it's annoying because people kind of freak out around me, and I've figured that out for a while now, but I also understand the benefits of it down the line. You know, even I'll just be very quiet at dinner, and then the new person starts to like try to slip in all of this information about themselves. So, you know, I just listen at that point, you know, when
I
they
didn't kill
get
her. I didn't kill her.
right.
I
There's
promise.
no such thing as infantile sexuality. I swear.
I swear, exactly.
um, but I mean, it makes me happy that we still want somebody to know like this, because when we don't, that's when we're in real trouble, I think, because there's not anyone then to address our speech to in the hopes of receiving something back. And that's the whole kind of setup of analysis, is that somewhere there's a desire to speak to someone who can return something to us, about who we are, what it is that we want, which feels so unbelievably mysterious. And you know, we're in this very strange time of a pandemic in which the authorities are, we really don't believe, I mean, at least here in the US, I don't know how it is there, but it's very hard to believe anything that anyone is saying. And all of the messages are contradictory. And I just wonder what this is going to do, because you don't want to, you know, there's no one to talk, there's no one to imagine speaking to.
You see, it's
listening.
very painful to see the political leaders trying to say something. And they all try, they're using every technique there is, you know, that spin doctors or whoever have invented in the last, say, 100 years. They're trying to do that, right? To show reassurance and also confidence and also empathy and also, you know, expertise and also vulnerability and also straight talk, but also poetic understanding. You know, there's like it's a mess. It's like if you turn down the volume and you see them, it's a mess of messages that express that lost moment for them and for everyone.
Lacan had a very precise term for this. He called it blah, blah, blah. Those are very French, right? Blah, blah, blah. No, but it's really the breakdown of desire, articulation, that kind of circuit, into just discourse, into just saying whatever, say whatever. And does that make you happy that I said that? I mean, it's really not the attempt to reach beyond oneself, which forces you to say something new and powerful. I mean, I think that's what's upsetting, is that if it wasn't just like, you know, you feel like the boardroom behind the press conference that told him to do X, Y, and Z, you don't feel like there's someone there who's actually trying to speak. So then they have to workshop it that night, and then, you know, try the next message the next day, even if it completely contradicted what happened a second before. And Trump is amazing at this, because he knows how to just in the middle of this throw, you know, something out of left field, and then everyone goes chasing after it for 24 hours. Why did he say that? What did he mean? What's going on? Can you believe he did that? And that takes up the time. I mean, it takes up everyone's time.
Yeah, I think he's amazing at something that we haven't found a word for. Something,
Yeah.
the way he performs. During the last election, I was covering it for a newspaper here, and I saw that Trump and Clinton were giving a speech the same weekend on Cleveland. So I went there, and on Friday I saw Hillary, and on Saturday I saw Trump. And at that time I was suspicious that the coverage of the media we're reading or listening to in New York was too perfect. Something was off, and I didn't know what it was. So I went to see for myself, and it was impressive to see the difference of Hillary Clinton just giving a perfect speech. There was no, you know, you could not complain about it. The entire setup was also perfect. You could take a picture from anywhere in the high school place where they did it, court, and from whatever you were taking the picture, you would see people, Hillary Clinton, an American flag, and some sort of message, right? It was perfect everywhere. And then I went to the Trump meeting. It was like tenfold of people. Like, it was like thousands and thousands of people outside Cleveland. There was no organization. It was crazy. It was like people just there. And just he showed up, was nothing there. It was just one flag and just a mic. And that was it. And then he opened his mouth and it was crazy. The electricity in the room, everything. And it wasn't like bigots or incels or lonely. No, it was families, 3 generations having a moment of happiness and encounter and closeness. And it was incredible. It was like something I left there like without, tools to explain what I had just seen. It was the first time in my life that I saw a leader doing something to thousands of people at once.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't tell what it was. You talk about this, I think, in one of your pieces, about how Hitler was sort of a hypnosis experiment, right?
Yeah.
For, and I don't know if it's that, and I don't want to compare Trump to Hitler or anyone to Hitler, because but he does something magical that we haven't grasped somehow.
There's a great article by Adorno, the Freudian theory and the pattern of fascist propaganda. And he's not talking about Hitler, although he brings up Hitler. He's talking about even like minor fascists in the US in the 50s, who I don't even know who these people are, but Adorno apparently did all this research into them. And he says it's a kind of oral magic, that you almost get hypnotized by the production of speech. That you want to watch, as if you want to watch these words come out of their mouth kind of endlessly, which I feel with Trump. I feel like I could watch him forever in a kind of fascination. And I had a joke theory, but it's not entirely a joke, because he has a kind of lisp. He has a kind of speech problem in which he makes a lot of neologisms. They're not quite neologisms because they're not new words, but he smushes words together. There's actually a video by The Daily Show that put them together. And Trump actually says, he says, I have the best words. They start with that, and then they go into all of these kind of new words that he produces. And, psychoanalytically speaking, it's as if he's built his entire being around this speech impediment, because the speech impediment is always there. And then he builds all of his language around it as if to hide it, but also reveal it, but make it present, but make it present in a glorified form, which is that he can't quite control his language. He has a very hard time in his speaking. And it was actually like we had this joke running about hydroxychloroquine, because it was as if, like, when he first said it, I looked. This is like my crazy being an analyst, but he worked very hard to pronounce it, hydroxychloroquine, as if he was trying to control the word itself. And I was like, oh, he has to go to the end with this now that he's figured out how to pronounce it. like it's on this level at which he believes. It's the belief in getting the word right, and that's all he needs. That's all he needs. It's not reality. It's not anything but that, which is why even after all of the tests prove hydroxychloroquine wrong, and like everyone's moved off of it, no one even cares that he said it, he still yesterday or a couple days ago had to come back and say, I'm taking it. I've been taking it for weeks. And I think it's because he figured out how to say it. And that's it. And this is
I don't know. I don't understand
to
what do you mean by a speech impediment? What kind of speech impediment do you see in him? I haven't noticed.
You haven't noticed? If you watch, he can't pronounce things. He slurs them. He pronounces words wrong. He mushes words together. So like he tried to say the origin and he kept saying oranges, or he tries to say stock market and he says slop rocket. Like he says the United States of America. Like sometimes he can't actually pronounce the syllables in a word. He has like a minor speech impediment of some kind.
It's funny because Biden does too. Biden has a stutter, right?
He has a stutter. Yeah. And the whole, for a person for whom language feels this slippery, how do they get control of it? What work do they do to make something, this language that is inhabiting them more than they are inhabiting it? And I think people come up with fascinating solutions to this. And I think somehow this is part of the hypnotic effect of Trump, who we watch say crazy things. We watch him just say these things. And he believes them because he believes in them to the extent that he needs to say it. He needs to follow his own voice in a very, very powerful way, I think, for his own sense of stability. And this is a miracle to us, especially we who believe in like the world and facts and evidence and things. I mean, just someone whose entire mind is trained on the production of their own speech as the only reality that counts for him.
Well, and on the other hand, he does something that's very common in marketing, right? He just says nice things that he wants them to be real, right? This is great. I am great. No, this is whatever. Transition to greatness. Transition to greatness. Transition to greatness. Like repeat the positive thing once and again, once and again, once and again, and then people will love you because you're the guy who says those things. And if you keep saying that you're the best, people will think, well, he may have a reason for believing that he's the best, right? And it works. It's amazing that it does. It's like it. I don't know.
But normally you don't believe this person. If
Normally,
someone's constant, normally you don't believe this person, but somehow we believe him.
Yeah.
Or he induces us to believe him. And that's what's interesting, because, you know, if someone says like, this is the best, this is the best, this is the best, at a certain point you get tired of it, but you don't get tired of watching him do it in the circumstances that he does it. So, I mean, hypnotism is fascinating. And, you know, it's very important for Freud in the group psychology or mass psychology essay, Mass Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. The hinge in it for Freud is the question of hypnosis, which is, why would we submit to another person? Why would we give up our own ego, which we guard with a kind of preciousness? Why would we give it over to the other? What is that about? And that's the question that he wants to ask in any form of groups, because that's what we do when we're a group at a certain point.
I interviewed Omri Boehm last week, and I asked him about why do we obey? This was the question, the main question I wanted him to reflect on. And he said something that a very typical answer to this is because when there's something at risk, there's fear or there's obeying an authority gives us a peace of mind that comes from the fact that we're not taking the risk, they are. We are responsible for a bad decision, they are, right? We are externalizing, you know, that, and that gives us, and even if we disagree with, or we all agree that our politicians cannot be believed in this context, that they are operating under political principles instead of like sanitary or other kind of principles, still, even being conscious of that, we still obey because then we can say it was their fault and not our fault. Mm-hmm. I don't know, just a thought that Omri put on the table.
No, I mean, much of what we're working on with patients, I mean, you don't want to necessarily make goals, but the idea is to separate the child in us from the parents, which we all, like, for whatever reason, we have a hard time doing. It's as if we stay children forever with the belief in the omnipotence of our parents that never existed. And, you know, to think that it takes this much, like, you know, 3 times a week psychoanalysis for 10 years to kind of pull someone, I mean, you know, I mean, it's worth thinking about. I mean, it gives you this feeling of reinventing the wheel, which is the same thing that you like kind of come across in the hospital, right? With this, like, how can I change something that's so broken in a way? And that was always I think that's one of the legitimate criticisms of analysis, this one by one by one work. Like, why would we not aim for something larger, for some more systemic change? And I have a hard time thinking about how what I understand and how I change an individual can be thought of on a societal level. I always want, like, the political philosophers or the social theorists to work with the psychoanalysts to think about how we can broaden what we do on a larger level, but it's something that never happens. It's like we go into our corners. I'll do my work one by one, and they'll think on a different level, but without the tools that analysis, I think, can provide in terms of why people are fixed in the ways that we are, or struggle with emancipating ourselves.
Well, thank you. It's been longer than I had planned. Thank you very much. It's been very illuminating. I hope you keep doing what you do. I don't know if that hope has any meaning, but the fact that you run to the front lines, I think that's very inspiring. However you decode that psychoanalytically for yourself, which is for you and just for you, I think watching it from outside, it's inspiring and good. So thank you.
Thank you.